The vanishing files. Subscribe if you dare, because what you're about to hear will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about crime, escape, and justice. Hit that button, drop your theories in the comments, and let's dive into a case that authorities tried to bury. The story doesn't begin with a break-in, a robbery, or a body in the street. It begins with a file that disappeared. On a cold January morning in 1979, a low-level clerk at the U.S. Marshals Service walked into his office in San Francisco and found something strange. A folder that should have been locked in the evidence cabinet, Case 24367, Alcatraz Escape, 1962, was missing. At first, he thought it was misplaced. People were careless sometimes and files went into the wrong drawers. But when he checked the logbook, the entry sent a chill down his spine. The file had been signed out, but not by anyone in his office. The name scrawled in the log was Frank Morris. It couldn't be. Frank Morris was dead, or at least that's what the FBI had said 17 years earlier. The clerk called his supervisor. Within an hour, the office was buzzing with whispers. Some thought it was a prank, others suspected an inside job. But when the logbook was checked for handwriting analysis, the examiner gave a conclusion no one expected: handwriting consistent with known samples of Frank Lee Morris. The case that had been declared closed, the case of the men who escaped from Alcatraz, was suddenly wide open again. The prison cell clue. To understand why this terrified officials, you have to go back to the night of June 11, 1962. Alcatraz, the Rock, sat in the middle of San Francisco Bay like a fortress of stone and steel. It was the kind of place built to make men disappear. But that night, in the silence of cell block B, 3 prisoners staged the most daring breakout in American history. When guards looked inside their cells, they saw what looked like 3 men asleep. Blankets pulled up, heads turned to the wall, the rise and fall of their chests almost convincing. But it was all a lie. The inmates were nothing more than papier-mâché dummies crafted from soap, toilet paper, and real hair collected from the prison barbershop. While the guards walked past, the real men were already gone, squeezing through holes carved in their cell walls, holes hidden by painted cardboard and chipped away with stolen spoons. Behind those walls was a utility corridor. Damp, narrow, forgotten. But it was the key to freedom. And that's where witnesses place Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence, on that night. Crawling on their stomachs, hauling raincoats stitched into a raft, and dragging tools cobbled together from stolen parts. They disappeared into the darkness. And according to official records, they drowned in the bay before ever reaching land. But if that were true, how did Frank Morris sign out his own case file 17 years later? The utility corridor escape. Investigators revisited the evidence, trying to piece together what they had missed. They looked again at the photographs of the utility corridor, grainy CCTV-style images showing shadows of men emerging from vents, carrying bundles of raincoats. Alan West, the 4th man who was supposed to escape, had been left behind. He couldn't break through his vent in time. His testimony shaped the official version of events. According to West, Morris and the Anglins had slipped out, climbed to the rooftop, and inflated their raft on the shoreline. He insisted they never made it. But West had also confessed something curious. He didn't actually see them drown. He only assumed. And assumptions, as one detective later said, are where mysteries are born. The rooftop shadows. A guard stationed near the yard that night swore he'd seen movement on the roof. A flashlight beam had swept across the concrete, missing 3 crouched figures by mere feet. The guard filed a report, but it was buried in the investigation, dismissed as unreliable. When the CCTV footage from the prison's roof was later reviewed, it was grainy and blurred, but 3 shadows were visible. Moving low, moving fast. The official record ignored this too. The shoreline. By the time the men reached the shoreline, the bay was cloaked in fog. The tide was shifting. The water temperature was a bone-crushing 50 degrees. The raft was a miracle of desperation, stitched together from more than 50 prison-issued raincoats, sealed with glue stolen from the workshop. On surveillance photos later reconstructed, the men could be seen hunched over it, inflating it with stolen concertina reeds, the mist curling around them like smoke. Authorities claimed the raft never survived the currents. But in the weeks that followed, fishermen reported something strange. A dark silhouette drifting in the mist, almost indistinguishable from the waves. When investigators combed the bay, they found a paddle and fragments of raincoat material washed up on Angel Island, not swept out to sea but inland toward the shore. That meant one thing: the raft had floated. The dummy discovery. Meanwhile, back inside Alcatraz, guards discovered the horror of the dummies. One officer reached down to nudge the sleeping inmate, only for the head to roll onto the floor, its painted eyes staring blankly. The prison went into lockdown. Sirens wailed. Helicopters roared overhead. But it was too late. 3 men had vanished. And then came the postcard. We made it. Tell no one. 2 weeks later, a postcard arrived at the home of a retired guard. No return address. No signature. Just 5 words scrawled in shaky black ink. We made it. Tell no one. The FBI dismissed it as a hoax. But handwriting experts quietly noted that the slant and spacing matched John Anglin's letters to his mother. If the men were alive, they had one message: keep the secret. The Brazil connection. Years passed. Rumors surfaced. Sightings in Florida. Sightings in South America. Then, in 1975, a faded CCTV-style photograph emerged. It showed a small rural farmhouse in Brazil. On the porch stood 2 shadowy figures. In the background, palm trees swayed in the mist. When the photo reached the Anglin family, they didn't hesitate. "That's my boys," their mother said. "I'd know them anywhere." The FBI called it inconclusive. But the grain, the posture, the faces blurred in the blue tint, it all whispered of survival. The toolbox. The most disturbing evidence came years later. Inside a shed on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, investigators uncovered a rusted toolbox. Inside were scattered papers, faded photographs, and a pocket knife with the initials FM engraved on the handle. The discovery should have been front-page news. But the documents vanished before they could be authenticated. Witnesses said men in suits arrived, sealed the evidence, and declared it classified. One investigator, speaking anonymously, later confessed, the knife was real, the photographs were real, and that toolbox proved they lived. The graves. The last chapter of Chapter 1 unfolds in a cemetery far from San Francisco. Grainy photos show 2 freshly dug graves side by side. One bore a crude wooden cross, the initials FM, scratched into the surface. Local records listed the graves only as foreigners. No birth dates, no family names. Just dirt, silence, and a mystery. By the time officials returned to investigate, the graves had been emptied. The coffins were gone. And with them, perhaps, the final proof. So here we are. A missing file signed out by a dead man. A postcard that declared survival. A farmhouse in Brazil. A rusted toolbox marked FM, and graves that held secrets the world wasn't meant to see. For decades, the official story has been that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers drowned in San Francisco Bay. But every clue, the shadows, the raft, the photographs, suggests otherwise. And if they did survive, then the real question isn't how they escaped. It's why they chose to vanish. Because when investigators dug deeper, they discovered something far more dangerous than an escape. Something that could explain why files went missing, why evidence disappeared, and why silence was enforced for over 50 years. The truth about the Alcatraz escape wasn't just about 3 men breaking free. It was about what they uncovered once they did. The conspiracy, the postcard, the photographs, the toolbox. By the time the 1980s rolled around, the story of the Alcatraz escape wasn't just a cold case, it was a ghost haunting federal files. And if Chapter 1 was about survival, Chapter 2 is about silence. Because the further investigators dug into the mystery, the more they realized it wasn't only about 3 men breaking out of prison. It was about something larger. Something someone didn't want uncovered. The postcard trail. The postcard that read, "We made it." Tell no one inch was dismissed by the FBI, but it wasn't the only one. Quietly, 2 more surfaced in later years. One arrived in 1981 at a Miami post office, addressed to a woman who had once dated Clarence Anglin. It carried no name, no return address, just a scrawled message, "We're safe. South." The other turned up in Argentina, mailed to a small-town police station. It contained nothing but a photograph of a bay at night, mist curling over the water. On the back, in shaky black ink, "Do you believe us now?" Neither was admitted into the official case file. Both were labeled hoaxes. But handwriting experts who saw the notes privately claimed the letters matched samples from John Anglin's prison records. If true, it meant the men were alive, and taunting the system that had declared them dead. The Brazil farmhouse. The faded CCTV-style photo of a farmhouse porch in Brazil was more than a curiosity. By 1980, the U.S. Marshals had quietly dispatched an agent south to investigate. He spent weeks interviewing locals, combing through property records and chasing rumors. What he found was chilling. The property deed was purchased in 1973 under the name John Roberts. Locals described 2 American men living there for nearly a decade. They were quiet, reserved, but friendly enough to the neighbors. They spoke broken Portuguese and often received visitors, other foreigners who never stayed long. But in 1979, the men left suddenly. Abandoned the house. No sale, no transfer, no goodbye. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared. When the investigator filed his report, it was buried deep in the archives. Months later, he received a warning from his supervisor: "You've done your part. Leave it alone." He never worked the case again. The toolbox evidence. The discovery of the rusted toolbox in a shed near Rio de Janeiro was the most damning evidence yet. Inside were papers, photographs, and that engraved knife with the letters FM. One of the photographs showed two men sitting on a porch, older now, with beards. They wore casual clothes and sunglasses, but their posture and bone structure resembled the Anglins. Another photograph was stranger still. It appeared to be of a coastline. But when examined closely, experts argued it wasn't Brazil at all. It looked like California. Why would escapees who supposedly drowned keep a photograph of the very coast they had fled? And the papers inside raised even more questions. Notes scrawled with dates, lists of names, some crossed out, some circled. Were they contacts? Dead drops? Or something darker? The knife was the most personal. Frank Morris wasn't known for sentiment, but an engraved knife suggested identity, ownership, a signature of survival. But the toolbox never made it into official evidence logs. It vanished, sealed away. One investigator whispered later, the government didn't want the public to know, because if those men lived, it meant the rock was broken. And it meant someone on the outside helped them. The graves. The two unmarked graves in Brazil added another layer. When journalists tried to dig into cemetery records, they found only vague entries, foreign males. No birth dates, no nationalities. By the time federal investigators arrived, the graves had been emptied. The locals gave conflicting stories. Some claimed strangers in dark suits came with shovels at night. Others insisted the graves were robbed by thieves. But one caretaker admitted something more unsettling. They were taken by officials, quietly, and they paid me to say nothing. If those bodies were indeed the Anglin brothers, someone had gone to great lengths to erase them from history. The network theory. By the mid-1980s, a new theory began circulating among investigators. The escape wasn't just a desperate attempt at freedom. It was orchestrated. Frank Morris had always been more than a common thief. He was methodical, intelligent, and well-connected. In prison, he had ties to men with reach, gangsters, smugglers, men who moved goods and people across borders. The Anglins, too, weren't strangers to organized crime. Their bank robberies hinted at connections. And their move to South America, if true, suggested a network was waiting for them. The theory went like this. The escape was funded from the outside. Tools, money, safe houses, and transport were arranged. The raft wasn't meant to get them across the bay, it was meant to get them to a pickup point. Once ashore, they were spirited away, given new identities, and shipped overseas. In other words, the escape wasn't just survival. It was extraction. The silenced voices. But if that was true, why suppress the evidence? Why bury postcards, photographs, and reports? The answer, some said, was embarrassment. If the government admitted the rock had been beaten, it would shatter the myth of Alcatraz as escape-proof. But others whispered of something deeper. In the 1960s and 70s, South America was a haven for fugitives. Networks existed that could hide criminals, deserters, even war criminals. If Morris and the Anglins had tapped into that network, exposing it would mean exposing far more than 3 escaped convicts. It would mean revealing a pipeline of fugitives protected by corruption, money, and power. And that was something no government wanted to admit. The telephone call. In 1992, the Anglin family received a phone call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was faint, old, but familiar. "We never drowned." The line went dead. Phone records traced the call to South America, but the exact origin couldn't be pinned down. The family swore it was Clarence. The FBI shrugged it off as another hoax. But the words echoed a truth too many investigators already suspected. The men had lived. The 2013 letter. Decades later, in 2013, a letter surfaced that reignited everything. Addressed to authorities of San Francisco, it read, "My name is John Anglin. I escaped from Alcatraz in 1962 with my brother Clarence and Frank Morris. I'm 83 years old and in bad shape. I have cancer. If you announce on TV that I will receive medical treatment, I will turn myself in. This is no joke." The letter was tested for fingerprints, DNA, and handwriting. The results came back inconclusive. Not proven, not disproven. The marshals briefly reopened the case. But no arrest followed. And quietly the letter was filed away. The cover-up. By now it was clear. The escape wasn't just about 3 men. It was about control. Control of the narrative. Control of the myth. Control of the truth. The rock had been sold to the public as escape-proof. If that illusion was shattered, what else could be broken? But for the families of Frank Morris and the Anglins, the truth wasn't just about myth. It was about blood. They knew their boys had lived. They had seen the photographs, received the flowers, heard the voice on the line. And if the men had lived, then the question was no longer, did they survive? It was, why were we never allowed to know? The whispers point to one chilling conclusion. The escape from Alcatraz wasn't just a prison break. It was a doorway into a hidden world. A world of networks that moved men across borders, silenced voices, and buried bodies. And somewhere in that world, the truth about Morris and the Anglins was buried too. Because when one final witness came forward, an ex-cop from Rio, he swore he had seen 2 old Americans on a porch in the early 80s. They smiled when they saw him. One even raised a glass. And then, he said, they spoke 5 words in English before disappearing back into the shadows. Don't believe what they say. The last secret. Subscribe if you've made it this far, because what comes next isn't just about escape. It's about betrayal, silence, and a truth darker than the waters of San Francisco Bay. The missing years. For decades, the trail of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers slipped through shadows. Brazil. Argentina. Rural graveyards. Postcards. Toolboxes. Letters. Always fragments. Always just enough to suggest they lived, but never enough to close the case. The marshal's official line never changed, status unknown. Still wanted. But within the bureau, a different story circulated. A story whispered over late-night coffee in field offices, buried in redacted memos, and passed between retired agents who couldn't let go of the case. The whisper said the men weren't just survivors. They were witnesses. The network. The theory grew from scraps of evidence. The engraved knife. The toolbox with lists of names. The sudden appearance of money in Brazil. Frank Morris wasn't just a bank robber. He was smart, calculating, and deeply connected. Before prison, he had brushed against networks of smugglers and money launderers who moved between Miami, New Orleans, and South America. Men tied to organized crime. Men who knew how to make people disappear. The whispers said the Alcatraz escape wasn't improvised. It wasn't 3 desperate men gambling with their lives. It was coordinated. The raft was just the first step. The real plan waited on the mainland, boats, cars, papers, and people ready to spirit them away. But coordination means witnesses. And witnesses mean risk. If Morris and the Anglins reached South America, they weren't living free. They were living under someone's thumb. The photographs. The photographs found in the rusted toolbox became the smoking gun. Experts studied them in secret. 2 men on a porch. Beards. Sunglasses. The Anglins older but alive. But another photo raised more questions than answers. A coastline jagged and windswept. When blown up, investigators swore it was the Northern California coast, not Brazil. What was it doing in a shed thousands of miles away? Some believed it was a reminder. A piece of home kept hidden in exile. Others believed it was a warning that the men had never gone as far as people thought. And a few, the most paranoid, believed it meant something darker. They had come back. The graves. The 2 unmarked graves in Brazil, emptied before DNA testing, were the most haunting clue of all. Why would anyone steal bones? Why erase evidence that could confirm death? The simplest answer was that the men buried there weren't the Anglins at all. They were decoys. Graves planted to close the trail. But one retired investigator offered a colder theory. He believed the bodies were the Anglins, and that they hadn't died of natural causes. They knew something, he said. Something they weren't supposed to. And someone made sure they stayed quiet. The letter. The 2013 letter, "My name is John Anglin," wasn't just a confession. It was a plea. If authentic, it suggested John had lived into old age, carrying the weight of silence for 50 years. He didn't boast of freedom. He didn't claim victory. He asked for medicine, for help, for acknowledgement that he still existed. The Bureau dismissed it as inconclusive. But the language, broken, weary, didn't sound like a hoax. It sounded like a man who had lived too long in the shadows. And maybe finally wanted out. The cover-up. Why did every piece of evidence vanish? Why were files sealed, photographs buried, graves emptied? The answer lies in what the escape represented. Alcatraz wasn't just a prison. It was a symbol. a fortress of American justice. To admit it had been broken was to admit vulnerability. But beyond embarrassment there was danger. If Morris and the Anglins were tied to larger networks moving drugs, money and fugitives through South America, then exposing them would mean exposing operations far bigger than a prison escape. And if they had stumbled into secrets, if they had seen or learned something during their time in hiding, it would explain why silence was enforced so brutally. Maybe they weren't just escapees. Maybe they were liabilities. The witness. In 2003, an American tourist in Rio claimed he met an old man who spoke perfect English with a Midwestern accent. Over drinks, the man told him a story. "I once broke out of the rock." The tourist laughed, thinking it was a joke. But the old man leaned in, deadly serious. "They never forgave us. That's why we had to disappear. Not from the guards. From them." When asked who them was, the old man only raised a glass and whispered, "You don't want to know." The tourist dismissed it, until he saw the faded photograph of the Anglin brothers years later. The resemblance chilled him. He went to the U.S. Marshals. They wrote down his statement. And then, like so many before, it vanished into a file stamped classified. The theory. So here's the theory most investigators won't say out loud. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived Alcatraz. They reached the mainland, aided by a network that specialized in making men disappear. They were funneled into South America, where they lived for years, maybe decades, under new identities. But survival came at a cost. They owed favors. They carried secrets. And eventually, those secrets became dangerous. Some say they were silenced. Others believe they lived quietly into old age, their story erased until nothing was left but whispers. And a few believe the truth is darker still, that the men cut a deal. That their silence was bought. That the postcard, the toolbox, the letter weren't mistakes but controlled leaks. Reminders to the world that they had outsmarted the system, but would never be allowed to return. The twist. Here's what unsettles me most. In 2018, facial recognition experts analyzed that Brazil porch photo once again. The technology had advanced. The software gave a result. 99.7% probability it was John and Clarence Anglin. The report was never released publicly. But leaked fragments confirmed it. And yet, the official line hasn't changed. They drowned. What? Because admitting otherwise doesn't just rewrite history. It exposes a truth that's far more terrifying. That the most secure prison in America wasn't broken by brute force. It was broken by planning, by patience, and by people who were never meant to be caught. The haunting end. So where does that leave us? 3 men vanished into the night of June 11, 1962. The government says they drowned. Their families say they lived. The evidence, the postcards, the toolbox, the graves, the letter, says they did both. Alive but buried. Free but silenced. And maybe that's the real ending. Not men escaping into glory, but men swallowed by shadows, punished not for escaping Alcatraz, but for surviving it. Because some escapes don't end with freedom. They end with silence. If you think this was the end of the story, think again. Because 3 months after that 2013 letter surfaced, another body was found washed up on a beach in Argentina. No ID. No family. Just scars on the face that matched an old prison photo. And the autopsy revealed something chilling. In his pocket was a folded piece of paper. On it were 5 words written in shaky ink. "We made it. Tell no one."